probably driven past a truck stop at midnight, seen a row of exhausted men in line for coffee, and figured trucking is just a hard job. Always was, always will be. But here's a number that should stop you cold. The American truck driver in 1980 was earning the inflation-adjusted equivalent of 6 figures, working a unionized 8-hour day, owning a home, taking real vacations. The American truck driver today is making 30 to 40% less in real terms, working 70 hours a week, and roughly a third of those hours go completely unpaid. So what happened? The answer isn't market forces. It isn't technology. It isn't globalization. The answer is a single piece of paper signed on a Tuesday in July that took a middle-class profession and crushed its pay in less than a decade. And the chain reaction that signature started, it touched something that arrived at your house this week without you ever noticing. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why the cheapest box on your porch costs what it costs and why no one has been able to undo any of it for 45 years. But let's start with what everyone gets wrong about trucking before 1980. Most people picture trucking as a job that's always been brutal. That's the assumption. It's also wrong by a margin that's almost embarrassing. Before 1980, truck driving was one of the best blue-collar jobs in the United States, period. Hourly wages topped $30 in major American cities in 1980 dollars. Adjusted that for inflation, and you're looking at a working class job that paid the equivalent of well over 6 figures today, with a union card, a pension, and predictable hours. Drivers bought houses on a single income. The industry called those years the golden age, and for once, the nostalgia held up. The numbers backed it up. But here's where it gets strange. The system that made trucking middle class wasn't an accident of a strong economy. It was a 45-year-old federal cartel written into law in 1935, run out of an agency most Americans have never heard of called the Interstate Commerce Commission. The ICC did 3 things. It set the rates trucking companies could charge. It controlled who was allowed to enter, and by blocking new low-cost competitors, it guaranteed that no carrier could survive by undercutting wages. The result was a closed loop. Tightly regulated rates flowed into tightly regulated companies, which flowed into a master freight agreement covering close to 1,000 trucking firms and the International Brotherhood of Teamsters representing the drivers inside them. The 8 largest trucking companies of the era earned a rate of return on equity twice that of the typical Fortune 500. The trucking companies were earning Fortune 500 money. The drivers were earning lawyer-adjacent money. Roughly 70% of all national freight spending in 1980 flowed through this regulated system. So when you imagine pre-1980 trucking, don't picture a free market. Picture the closest thing the United States ever built to a guild. New carriers couldn't undercut. Drivers couldn't be replaced by cheaper labor because there was no cheaper labor allowed inside the gate. It worked by every metric for nearly half a century, but that's only the surface. The real story is what happens when one signature destroys it on a Tuesday afternoon, and the wage collapse that follows is faster and deeper than anything labor economists thought was possible. July 1st, 1980, President Jimmy Carter sits down with a pen. The Motor Carrier Act of 1980 is on his desk. The cartel that had run American trucking for 45 years dies the moment he signs it. He believed, sincerely, that he was lowering inflation and freeing the economy. He was. But he was also pulling the load-bearing wall out of the entire labor market, and nobody understood how fast the would come down. The collapse started immediately. With entry controls gone, new trucking companies flooded in, most of them non-union, most of them charging less than the regulated rate. Truckload shipment rates fell 25% between 1977 and 1982 in inflation-adjusted dollars. The number of licensed carriers more than doubled by 1990. Exceeding 40,000. And here's where the math turns brutal. The established union carriers couldn't match the new rates and survive. By 1983, more than 70 of those carriers had closed. By 1986, that number wasn't 100, it wasn't 500, it was 4,000. 4,000 companies erased in 6 years. And this connects to something sitting in your kitchen right now, but we'll get to that. The drivers from those bankrupt union carriers didn't disappear. They were rehired at a fraction of their previous pay. Same trucks, same routes, same drivers, half the paycheck. By 1998, drivers were earning 30 to 40% less than their pre-1980 predecessors in real terms. In some regions, the drop was closer to 50%. This wasn't a slow generational decline. This was a wage collapse measured in months. But here's what nobody talks about. The Teamsters didn't just lose pay, they lost the ability to fight. In 1980, the last full year of regulated trucking, nearly 800,000 American workers participated in strikes. By 2021, that number had collapsed to 80,700, a 90% drop. By the early 1980s, a third of Teamsters truck drivers were already on long-term layoff. The membership base, the strike fund, the political muscle, all of it eroded in real time. And yet, the deepest cut was a single sentence buried in a labor law from 1938 that nobody had been paying attention to. Until now. Here's the part the trucking industry has spent 45 years quietly hoping you'd never look up. In 1938, Congress passed the Fair Labor Standards Act. It created the federal minimum wage. It created the 40-hour work week. It created overtime pay at time and a half for every hour past 40. It is the legal foundation under which almost every American working today expects to be paid for their hours. Almost every American. Buried in the FLSA is a single provision called Section 13B1, the Motor Carrier Exemption. 3 lines of legal text that exempt drivers, helpers, loaders, and mechanics in interstate commerce from the overtime protections of the entire law. Why? By the Department of Labor. So they handed jurisdiction over driver hours to one agency and left the overtime rules of the other agency switched off. With the Teamsters strong and the Masters Freight Agreement covering most of the industry, this didn't matter. The union negotiated overtime contractually. But here's where it gets genuinely strange. The moment 1980 deregulation collapsed the union's power, that 1938 technicality became the most important sentence in the trucker's economic life. With the Teamsters gone from most carriers, there was no contract enforcing overtime. The federal law explicitly said no one had to. So the entire industry shifted its pay model. Drivers used to be paid by the hour. After deregulation, they were paid by the mile. And here's the math everyone misses. A driver paid by the mile earns nothing during loading, nothing during unloading, nothing during the hours stuck at a dock waiting for a forklift. Nothing during traffic, nothing during weather, nothing during the federally mandated 10-hour rest break, even if they're on the road sleeping in a truck. According to the Owner-Operator Independent Driver Association, drivers spending 12 to 20 hours per week in detention, just sitting at docks waiting, can lose between $63,000 and over $100,000 per year in earnings. 17% of drivers never receive detention pay at all. The DOT estimates drivers collectively lose more than $1 billion every single year to unpaid waiting. A 1938 safety provision written to protect drivers became the legal mechanism for working them for free. And now we're about to see how all of this lands in your daily life. You've been touching this system every single day of your life and never had a name for it. That Amazon box on your porch, the rate it's shipped at exists because of the post-1980 freight rate collapse. The driver who hauled it was almost certainly paid by the mile, which means the hours that box sat on his trailer waiting at a distribution dock, those hours were on his clock, but not on his paycheck. The price of milk at your grocery store, the price of cheese, eggs, lettuce, every cold thing on every shelf. American grocery prices are among the lowest in the developed world, partly because of post-1980 rate compression that flowed downhill from carriers to drivers and onto the produce aisle at a discount. Every retailer's free 2-day shipping promise, built on a pre-mile pay structure that erases the dock time, the loading time, the rest break time, and the weather delay time from the driver's wallet, but not from his week. The driver shortage you've been hearing about for years, it's not a shortage of people who can drive a truck. It's a shortage of people willing to do this specific job at this specific pay structure. Annual driver turnover at America's largest trucking fleets has run as high as 90 to 100% for years. That's not a logistics problem. That's a wage problem with a 1938 legal exemption written underneath it. The exhausted driver you saw at the rest stop, the parked rigs idling all night with men sleeping inside them, they were all on the clock. Most of them were earning nothing for that exact hour. The cheapest consumer goods era in human history was built on a workforce that legally works roughly a third of its weekly hours for free. So, here's where you actually land. You drove past that truck stop thinking you were looking at a tough job that always paid badly. But what you were actually looking at was a 1935 federal cartel that built a middle class, a 1938 overtime exemption nobody noticed for 42 years, a 1980 signature that removed every guardrail in a single afternoon, a Teamsters union that lost 2/3 of its trucking power in a decade, a per-mile pay model that erased every non-driving hour from the paycheck, and a chain reaction that quietly turned roughly a third of every trucker's working week into unpaid labor. The cut every truck driver's pay in half was not a metaphor. It was a math problem hidden inside one signature, one forgotten 1938 loophole, and one quiet collapse of union power. You're not just looking at a tired man, you're looking at the load-bearing wall of the modern American economy and the price somebody had to pay so the box on your porch could cost what it costs. And if you think trucking is broken, wait until we get into why the company driver and the owner-operator parked next to him are technically working in two completely different economies, and only one of them is allowed to win.